My father was Miko Peled, and growing up as a young Israeli, that was a big deal, you know. It was something that I would hear constantly, you're Miko Peled's son, you're Miko Peled's son, you're Miko Peled's son, and many times it was positive, but many times it was very negative. He was a young patriot in the early 40s. He joined the Israeli militia, the Jewish militia, the Haganah, the Palmach, and all this, believed in the right of the Jews to reclaim their land and so forth. Complete ideologue, complete believer in the cause. And then after 1948, he remained as an officer and became a career officer. And he was one of that. He was of that generation that Israel refers to as the founders, because they were the young officers of 1948 who really defeated the Arabs of 1948 and gave us, the state of Israel, and then as generals completed the conquest and gave us the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and so forth, which was of course a huge victory, 6 days, and all this all this mythology. So in that regard, he was a hero. He was one of those giants. Then what he did was, as soon as the 1967 war was over, as soon as it was over, literally, the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command, he stood up and he said, well, now we need to make peace with the Palestinians. We have a chance to make peace with the Palestinians. And he didn't doubt that we have a right to the land. He didn't doubt that it was all ours, but he believed that we have to recognize there is another nation living on this land, and we have an opportunity for a compromise, a historic compromise, which will allow them to which will allow recognition of their rights to a state and so forth, self-determination, but also allow us to maintain the majority of the state and be the powerful force. So a small state for the Palestinians in two tiny areas that Israel determined, the West Bank and Gaza, under conditions, of course, that would be favorable for Israel. And then from that day on, until he retired from the military and so forth, but then to the end of his life, he was promoting this idea that we know today as the two-state solution. That is really when the two-state solution, as we know today, this idea was born by him and several other Israelis who were completely Zionist, who completely believed in the Zionist idea, but realized we have to make a small compromise. The rest of Israel wasn't interested. As he was saying these words, as the war was wrapping up of 1967, the Israeli bulldozers were already destroying towns and villages and really continuing the ethnic cleansing and genocide. So there was never any interest on the other side. Now, once he retired and this became his thing, and he began meeting with members of the PLO who were kind of open to this idea to compromise, that's when he became the enemy. That's when being the son of Miko Peled suddenly became a bad thing, because he was an Arab lover. And of course being an Arab lover is a terrible thing, and he was a supporter of the PLO, and he met with Arafat and all these kinds of things which were unheard of, which were terrible things at the time. In hindsight, I think that he and his group had a lot to do with convincing the PLO leadership and Yasser Arafat to, in the late 80s, change and recognize Israel and give up the arms, give up the struggle altogether, really. And again, in hindsight, that was catastrophic for the Palestinians, because a lot of it has to do with why we are today. The fact that they dropped the struggle, the fact that they agreed to recognize Israel is part of the problem today. So in hindsight, I think it was a very bad thing for the Palestinians. I think that he and his group were naive. They believe that you can restrain this settler colonialist project, and you cannot restrain colonialism. Like Frantz Fanon said, colonialism is an animal that has no restraints, it has no rationale. You cannot restrain it, you can only overpower it with more power, with more force. And again, BDS is that force. I believe that BDS is that force with which you can not restrain it, but defeat it. You can't restrain that beast. And he thought you could restrain it, and of course he was wrong, What inspired me to write the book were actually friends who knew my story and said that there was a book there to be written. When it's you don't really think much of it. So, and the journey is the journey of an Israeli in Palestine. So geographically, it's a very short journey, because Israel is Palestine, which many people don't realize. People say Israel, Palestine, as though it's two places. Israel is Palestine, Palestine, Israel, it's the same place. And so the journey is not very far geographically, but the journey from the sphere of the privileged the sphere where everything is clean and safe and the roads are paved and you have plenty of water and your rights are secure and you have no worries, to the journey of the oppressed, the journey of the occupied, the journey of the dispossessed is an enormous journey, mentally, emotionally, politically. And in Palestine, this journey is very strange because it's very short. In other words, as an Israeli, as the occupier, we never live more than 5 or 10 minutes away from Palestinian communities. And I grew up in Jerusalem, so it's even more so. And the differences are so stark, yet we have no access. In other words, we have no understanding of how big the differences are. I always assumed that everybody lived like me. And whenever I did encounter Palestinian communities as a child traveling throughout the country, it always seemed a bit strange that they're so different, that their towns are dusty and dirty, and whereas ours are always green and clean, and it seemed weird. But that's, you accept the reality as it is. And you usually tend to blame, the oppressed for being the way they are. So that was the journey, and then as I was, the longer the journey continues, and it still continues, the more I discover, the more I learn, the more I become, again, understanding and appreciation for the Palestinian experience, for the Palestinian reality, for Palestine itself as a country, as Palestinians as a nation, as a culture, and so forth. To the point where, and I'm stealing this phrase from my nephew Guy, who says, to make the transition from being an occupier to being an immigrant, from being the colonizer to being an immigrant, which is, a very different place. When you come as an immigrant, you appreciate the land that you come to. Of course, as a colonizer, you come because you think you have rights and you're better than they are. So that really sums up the journey, in a few words.